Hello, welcome back to another episode of the FGLI podcast. My name's Joanne.
My name's Khaliun.
And today we are joined by our guest speaker, Marc Lo. Hi, Marc. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good. Great. Could you introduce yourself?
Sure. I am Dr. Marc Lo. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I have the pleasure of being the inaugural executive director for Penn First Plus.
Great. So before we begin learning more about your FGLI experience and your job here as a director, let's start with a quick icebreaker. So if you had to eat a specific cultural cuisine for the rest of your life, which one would that be?
Sure. This is hard because I am multiracial, and also I could not live without dumplings for the rest of my life, so it has to be Chinese food.
Yeah, I love Mexican food. I love the fusion of flavors, the spice levels. I would unfortunately leave behind my cultural cuisine.
I think for me, I'm a creature of habit, so kind of like growing up eating Chinese food all of my life, I feel like that's something I'm just gonna have to stick with for this answer.
All right, so getting started as the director of Penn First Plus, Marc, I'm really curious on how you view what Penn First Plus looks like if it would be used to the maximum utility by a FGLI student, starting from their first day at Penn to their last.
Sure. One of the things that we pride ourselves on at Penn First Plus are the connections that we develop with different campus resources. So witnessing students engaging with all of our pre-professional and scholarly development programming, because we know that's so important and core to Penn undergraduate culture. That's something that we always aspire to, but we also know that one of the most important things that first-gen students can do is develop connections of their own. And so the fact that we have such an amazing space that usually somewhere around 11 in the morning until we close is packed with students who feel comfortable coming and asking us any question they may be otherwise embarrassed to ask, either because they feel like they should know it, which is something that a lot of us first-gen folks carry with us, or because it feels uncomfortable talking about money issues in a place where it seems like money is not a barrier to a lot of folks, cultivating that sense of comfort for students.
And I remember it was like during NSO my junior year, kind of seeing Penn First Plus evolve as a really place for students to be compared to like the GIC or just individually in clubs. I remember coming in and this random student just came and was like, do you guys happen to have any sunscreen? Like, I'm burning up, please help me. And Zeta pulled up and she had the sunscreen. And it's just like one of those great ways of the community. And also like during the Friday study breaks, just seeing students be able to have that one-on-one conversation, meet new people, and then get a chance to kind of like pull away from the Penn academic culture.
Listen, the random things that some of us have in our desks, either because we need them or we know our students might need them, let's just say that there are giant salt and pepper mills someplace in this office in the event you're ever having lunch in here.
I also remember, since I'm a current freshman, at first I didn't really know that there was a whole community like dedicated to the FGLI community, and so being someone who kind of grew up in like, I guess, a limited income environment as well, in New York, I was really unsure of like, what is my status, how am I going to come across or approach these conversations such as finances, and as you said, like in a place where it seems as if like finances aren't like such a huge barrier to some individuals, but for me it's like a difficult conversation to have. And so when I did come to Penn, I was introduced to actually the Gateway Student Mentorship, and I had the pleasure of being a mentee, and I really appreciate my mentor. Shout out to Alana out there if you're listening, for really being there for me and kind of being that peer that I thought I would never have met or have like in my life. But otherwise, kind of moving on to kind of like your views or your goals for the next, I guess, 5-10 years, up to you, for P1P, like how's the optimism going? Like, where do you think we can expect for this program?
I think we're fortunate at Penn that we remain really committed to access to all the opportunities of a Penn education, and that commitment goes all the way to the top. And so a lot of our conversations right now are about really thinking, are we budgeting the right amount of funding for things like textbooks for our students? Thinking through market forces and all of those other topics, not to get deep into the weeds on those, because I know it's a sensitive and complicated issue. The other piece, and this was a question, we are toward the tail end of having conversations with students, with a lot of campus partners, and one of the things that's been a theme is really making sure that we're doing our best to increase awareness amongst our FGLI students of all of the amazing opportunities that they have access to. Right, over the last 5 years, we've closed participation gaps for students engaging in research. We've increased the number of students participating in global opportunities. But when we think about the next 5 years, it's about all of the additional things that make those experiences great. Like when you go abroad, funding should not keep you from making the most of the country that you're studying abroad in. And so thinking through how we can address that. Really thinking through how we have conversations with faculty, students, and staff about the meaningful connections, like the one you were just talking about with Alana, that make the experience of being at Penn so incredibly rewarding. How can we engage more faculty in those relationships? And all sorts of things that help students to feel as though they're not alone while they're here at Penn, and they really have the sense of community that you all have found by touching down here and with our other campus partners across West Philadelphia.
While we're talking about resources, I'm wondering what are some underrated resources you have at Penn First Plus, or that you're aware of on campus that you think seniors should take more advantage of?
I would say at the top of my list is going to be the library. It's really easy right now in 2025 to forget that there's this huge, incredible resource just behind the button where you can go and you can connect with someone who's an expert in how to conduct research in your field, a subject area librarian. The power of and the ease of reading a book instead of downloading a chapter, the study space, the digital tools. It's a repository of all of these little but deeply meaningful things that can just make the process of being a student, whether it be writing your first paper or working on your thesis or just learning about a new form of a digital art in the digital commons that will just enrich your academic and your personal experience.
I love that you mentioned that, because I love the library, like the find either like those resources, getting an actual handheld copy of a book you want to read. I've been going through like the Game of Thrones books, and it's just like a great way to like kind of take a step back, go back to reading instead of like getting in your head, spending too much on social media, and then exploring your other research. I was like checked out a couple of books on U.S. history, but from a more like sociologist point of view, which I don't think I've taken a class at Penn yet that really covers that well. And just to have it like, I put in the request, 2 to 3 days later I have the book.
Wow, yeah. Also, something that I really like about like Penn in general is kind of unpopular opinion. I think the writing seminar requirements, a lot of students think that like, hey, it's heavy on research, like you're putting so much work into writing all of these papers and being prepared for like your midterm portfolio or like your final portfolio. But in reality, like very recently, like I'm still writing seminar right now, I'm enjoying it a lot, is once, as you both said, like the library resources. I was introduced to the staff that was representing or kind of like in charge of all of like helping out with research, especially from the library, like for our specific writing seminar class. And we've been told that like, hey, Penn also has like, or Penn Library also like allows us to have like subscriptions to like New York Times and like the Washington Post and like all of these other articles that outside of Penn, like you kind of had to like pay out of your own money, and it's, for some people like that might be a difficult thing. Like for me, like before like college, like whenever I needed to do research for like, let's say like public forum debate, which was something I did in high school, it was often hard for me to get like reliable sources. So to have that access and to be like a student who is under like a facility where they strongly believe in research and like the power of what research can do for our society, like that's just honestly amazing. And I really am glad that you did bring that up.
Joanne, I'm so glad you mentioned the free access to periodicals.
Right.
Because if you are a student and you're not using your free access to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and a bunch of the other free periodicals, you need to log in right now and make sure you get that access.
For sure, for sure. But otherwise, kind of moving on, so how do you think other colleges or universities should probably approach creating FGLI programs or approach the conversation of being a FGLI student at their facility?
Sure, I think this is going to vary a lot depending on the institution. One of the reasons why I went back to get a PhD was because I was working at places like MIT and Brown, where FGLI students were in the minority, and that's not the case at a lot of regional state institutions, community colleges, so on and so forth. So the conversation there is a little bit different because they might be in the majority, and so folks are used to that level of socioeconomic diversity. I think for institutions that are like the University of Pennsylvania, so highly resourced, highly selective, I think one of the things that I've enjoyed seeing over the course of the last 10 years of my career is folks shifting from talking about FGLI students as students that these institutions are rescuing from difficult lives. And don't get me wrong, the experience of being limited income in the United States is not an easy one, right? But shifting the narrative to focusing on how incredibly brilliant and high achieving these students are, and the plurality of experiences that they bring into the academy that helps to enrich the diversity of thought that can take place here, and also how some of those character traits that you develop by virtue of being FGLI, set you up to really take advantage of and exceed in places like this. I think being mindful of all that FGLI students really need is an awareness of all the opportunities they now have access to, and the time and the space to be able to plan out how they're going to use them all. I think I would put those at the core for thinking for places like Penn and our peer institutions and highly selective liberal arts colleges, so on and so forth.
Kind of jumping off that, because you've been here from the start of Penn First, plus seeing how it's evolved, how do you think it's changed as like the level of an administrator? And then if you interact with students a lot, how has it, or we can kind of input on that, how has it changed from like the start of Penn First plus as a student till now?
Oh my goodness, there was this really weird moment that began sometime in March of 2020 that kind of colors perspective on this a little bit. I think there was a lot of really great fervent energy about how quickly we were going to build and manifest this vision for Penn First Plus, and we achieved all of it in the last 6 years. The intention was to do it in 5, but the pandemic kind of shifted that. And I think there was a moment from 2020 until I would say late 2021, early 2022, where a lot of what we were doing was focusing on how do we provide our FGLI students with the tools to navigate this weird mix of public health crisis plus the constant anxiety of whether or not they'll need to go home and not be able to study from home and all of that, to not being able to be on campus to develop that community, to now we're really picking up steam again to where we were back in like February of 2020, which was having lots of really strong student organizations feeding into the vision of what Penn First Plus could be. One of the things that Penn has always benefited from is a group of really dedicated, really strong student leaders helping to provide voice of where we should go with this work. And what I'm grateful for right now is that over, I would say, the last year and a half, 2 years, we've gotten back to more of that place that we were pre-pandemic, as organizations like Penn First and Figley Dab and Wharton Figley, and there are 5 more that I'm skipping naming right now for the sake of time, that are really helping us to make progress in ensuring that we're taking in the perspectives of students from all 4 undergraduate schools, to work with faculty and staff to make sure that we're advising students and teaching students in really expansive ways that focus on their strengths and how we can better support them to grow academically, rather than being responsive to the next crisis that's coming across the desk because we can't go back to being in person like we wanted to. So I'm really grateful that, Penn committed a lot of resources during the pandemic to trying to support students, but now we're back into a place where we're forward thinking about the next steps for this work.
Kind of straying away from the conversation of Penn First Plus, like in general, kind of moving into conversing with Figley students and maybe Figley viewers out there. What advice would you give to students experiencing like imposter syndrome, or I guess for Penn students specifically, Penn face, and how did you combat that emotion in your undergraduate experience?
I always preface this by saying imposter syndrome does not go away. It is something that you will encounter throughout your life as long as you continue to fall into the trap of comparing your success to others' success. And I know that it can be this moment or this series of moments in quick succession where you just feel like you're not doing well at anything, that you're not meant to be there. And for Philly students in particular, what I'll emphasize is, by virtue of being admitted to college, you have already proven to a group of folks who read your lengthy admissions application and your transcripts and your letters of recommendation that you have the ability. You have proven your ability. It's the question of, is this a moment that there's something that I need to grow through? Is this a moment where I just have too much going on in life, so I'm not able to maximize on the skills and the knowledge that I know that I have? Is there something else going on that's serving as a barrier for me, to me being who I know I can be in this moment? And sitting with those questions and all the questions that go along with those core questions, to kind of accept the moment for what it is and figure the pathway to moving beyond that imposter phenomena, right? It's, how can I reconcile what's happening with myself so that I can get back to being as awesome as I know I can be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've talked to it before on the podcast, but especially with like getting used to being with peers who have significantly like more money than you, just straight up, like more cash on hand, you have to also really like locate where is that insecurity coming from, as you mentioned. And sometimes that results in like, sometimes you just have to delete Instagram. And I think it's just like reminding yourself like you are qualified to be here, but then also taking those actions, because like it's real feelings, to be like, okay, why am I feeling this way? How to take that out. And we have resources at Penn, like CAPS, like coming and talking to your Figley mentors, upperclassmen, through GSM, I bet, to address that outside of like trying to switch your mentality too. But like that is the major first step.
Yeah. And the entire conversation of imposter syndrome has always like been a common topic that we like to talk about in the Figley podcast. So it's really great to kind of hear insights from other people, like how are they combating imposter syndrome? How are they approaching the conversation of what imposter syndrome is and how it affects their experience as a student or as a faculty member, and so forth. Since we have mentioned kind of like finances and kind of like the conversation of like how to approach finances, how do you think FGLI students should view finances when it comes to being an undergraduate or a graduate student?
Sure. I just want to say one more thing that just popped in my head about imposter syndrome. I think the most important thing that you can have as a FGLI student is that person or those persons who, when you're in the middle of an episode of imposter syndrome, will show you that tough love and remind you of how excellent you are, right? And really take you to task for what what you might be feeling, whether that's a counselor or whether that's your academic advisor or whether that's your best friend. And in terms of thinking about money, which was your next question, I think what's really common for folks who are coming from limited income communities is this notion that you are your family's savings account, retirement fund, emergency fund, so on and so forth. And that's a very, very real thing. That's, conditioned on the relationships that you have, the culture you come from, and also, there's this other piece of this question that I encourage folks to hold of what can you provide your family in such a way that's not leaving you in a precarious state with your education. Because embedded within that notion that you are, your family's savings account and retirement fund is this long-term picture of what's going to happen when you graduate college. And, being able to make sure that you provide your family with the support that they need, but also maintain the support that you need so that you can graduate and then do even more when you're done is an important piece to hold. And I know how hard that can be because, if your family might be on the precipice of losing their home and they need a lot of money immediately, the instinct will be to give them everything that you have. And there's nothing wrong with that. That is a totally understandable reaction. And also thinking about how you're going to recover financially from that so that you can continue to take care of yourself and complete your semester is the other piece where it's really helpful to have conversations with folks who can navigate that sensitivity, whether that be a good mentor or someone from a financial wellness resource. So I think to put it succinctly, it would be, recognizing that within, for some FGLI folks within their culture, there are lots of immediate needs, but also encouraging them to think, a little bit longer term where possible and with the right supports too.
And there's like the opposite, almost like survivor's guilt is because like Penn, you have so many cool things to do and they're always like, they're fun and you get to do it for free. Like so many college house takes you to like 76ers games and you get to sit in like this nice private suite, and then you often, like, I know a lot of people think of like their family or maybe their friends back home who grew up in similar circumstances where it's like they would never or wouldn't get to experience this at the same time you are. And it's something that for some people might encourage them to spend money more because they're trying to like heal that inner child. For other people it's like they're feeling guilty talking to their parents about these circumstances.
Right.
And knowing that is a common experience in the FGLI community and that you can come to places like Penn First Plus and speak about these more freely versus I like thinking like this is a unique situation. So at least in the circumstance I grew up in, like FGLI wasn't an identity. It was like a box I just so happened to check. And all my experience kind of felt like my own, like no one would understand it. And you start talking and then you figure out like, we do have differences. We're not monolith, but also like we do tend to have like shared experiences and that it's okay to talk about it. And it's not like something that'll like be a bummer or something that's like just you and your emotions getting into your head. Like it's something we experience.
How do you think like postgraduate career opportunities and resources can be best tailored to maybe support like FGLI students, especially after college?
This is a great question because we're chatting with alumni relations about that this
Oh.
right now. And I had a great conversation with one of our alums from, I think, 2022, 2023, because there are aspects of being faculty that continue after you graduate too, right? I was just talking about, familial support expectations. And I personally remember when I got my first full-time job, there was the option to have a payroll deduction to go into a 401k. And I said, why do I want to give away 5% of my paycheck? And so it took a conversation a few months in with a colleague for me to realize you're essentially giving away free money because it was going to be matched by the employer that will help you when you retire 40 years from now, right? And so those are conversations that I know that our recent alums really want to have with students, because they, much like I figuring that stuff out for myself, have been figuring it out on their own, and they want to make sure that students graduating from Penn right now, Figley students graduating from Penn right now, are prepared for all of those questions, right? When you're presented with 9 different healthcare options, ranging from $40 a month to $300 a month, each one with different benefits, how do you make that choice, right? And so, those are resources that we're really looking to develop as part of our next 5-year plan. And there's a lot more that goes into that conversation as well, because I know that one of the things that preoccupies, our community is how much money you're going to make when you graduate, right? And, there's the first job that you take when you graduate, and that could be the job that pays you lots of money, that builds up your savings so that you can take the dream job. And then there's also the job that can be, the first landing spot on your way to even bigger dreams and aspirations. And that's another conversation that we want to work with alumni to have with our current students, is because whichever you choose, it's a valid choice, especially if it's values aligned, and especially if you're thinking of, yes, absolutely, I will take this job that will offer me $120,000 a year with a 15% signing bonus, even if I have to work 70 hours a week, because I know that 3 years after, 3 years later, I might go on to something else that will be more aligned with my passions. And so cultivating more of those conversations is something that we really look forward to doing in the next few years.
Yeah. And with how strongly pre-professional Penn is, I feel like it's also a question of when do you start that conversation with students? Because I know when I talk to my advisors that first year, they're always just kind of like, just focus on your classes, don't worry about grad school, med school, whatever, till then. But I feel like it's important for Figley students to get like a good idea of what that would entail, because I know for many of us, it was like these postgraduate or graduate institutions are just kind of like a vague idea. You might know how many years it would take. You might have like an idea of what exams you'd have to take to qualify. But it was a really blurry picture until I finally sat down with someone. And at that point, it was overwhelming. You have to check all these boxes. But also, freshmen, you want them to focus on our classes. So how do you think we should approach that balance of when do you start talking about graduate school?
If I were to think about my colleagues in the Center for Undergraduate Research and Fellowships and some of the conversations that we're having right now, I think for all students, regardless of whether or not a graduate degree is on the horizon, it's important to start early with developing your relationships with faculty, because those relationships are going to be the ones that might get you that first internship or that first research opportunity before you even know what you want to do. And they can also be the folks that, as you start to do really well in their classes, or if you get a role in their labs, can say, hey, have you thought about going on to get a master's degree or a PhD? And also, here are the pros and cons of a graduate degree versus going off into industry. And so I think those conversations can start as early as their first semester here, and that's part of acknowledging just the pace at which all of these pre-professional anxieties tend to start to build the mask that is Penn face. But also, if you start by focusing on relationships with faculty, you're actually setting the baseline of a dynamic that can help you throughout your time at Penn, regardless of what path you choose. Because a lot of these folks are also going to have connections with alums and or with industries that will help you do whatever it is you want to achieve. And if they don't know someone, then one of their other faculty members will. And so I think you don't have to answer what it is you want to do too early, but I think it's imperative to start to think about relationships with faculty as soon as you get to campus.
Actually, speaking on kind of talking with faculty and building that relationship even in your first semester here at Penn, I'm kind of wondering about your experience. So do you ever, I guess, see yourself within the students that you have interacted with? And has that ever affected your overall experience as inaugural executive director here?
Absolutely. So I went to my undergraduate degrees from Northeastern University, which has a cooperative education model. Our first semester, we took a class called College 101, where one of the assignments was writing your first resume. And so I well, actually, I do think of college as growing up, right? I came up through an institution that was very pre-professional in its culture. Also, as someone who has a very strong achievement orientation himself, I do witness a lot of that in my students too. And I think, I also see some of the behaviors that I was stuck in when I was in college and graduate school in terms of comparing what I was ticking off the to-do list versus the rate that other folks were ticking off their to-do lists. And because of that, it's why we always try to de-escalate the culture of comparison in conversations with students, because a lot of, not just myself, but also other members of the Penn First Plus team remember what that was like and how unhealthy that can feel and how and the impacts that can have, on your mental and emotional health. And so in seeing that and knowing all the amazing things our students are already doing, being able to help them figure out, when is enough for them and what they want to accomplish long term.
You did mention just now that you did have your experience as an undergraduate at Northeastern, and soon you also had the graduate experience at NYU. And we're kind of wondering, how was the mentorship that you've experienced in that? Or how was your overall undergraduate or overall college experience that you had at those two colleges? So kind of a chance to reminisce the past.
Sure. I think what I always say to everyone is, if you don't think about your past and cringe a little bit, you haven't grown.
That's a great saying.
Right. I think I would not be here today if it wasn't for some of the fantastic mentorship that I received from folks who realized that I really enjoyed what I was doing as a work study in admissions or as a resident assistant or as leader of a student organization, to say, you might want to think about this as a career, especially because you've changed your major 3 times. And being sponsored to go to a conference where I got to interact with master's students from NYU and say, that's who I want to be, maybe not when I grow up, but in the next few years. And then being fortunate enough to have mentors who are leaders in professional associations to really connect me with folks who shared my values and, set me up for a lot of great leadership opportunities. I think I've, over the course of my career, I've always reported to or been indirectly reporting to someone who is the chair of a professional or scholarly association. And that's something that I try to model for my team too, with my continued involvement, because that's where you can find so much powerful mentorship and spaces to hone your leadership skills and bring in a perspective that you might not necessarily get exposed to by every day, right? And so I'm grateful for all those professional and academic mentors who helped to lead me down that path and cultivate a CV that today I'm proud of and can say, you know what, that's enough for me for right now.
Especially for first-year students, it can be very hard to, I guess, interact with professors or kind of like find some sort of staff member or faculty member that you want to kind of like look forward to, or like have random conversations with, or overall like have some sort of mentor and student relationship. So I guess for students, do you have any maybe like tips that you might have to maybe connect with a professor, connect with some faculty member, from either the experience of trying to find one or maybe being a mentor for someone else?
It is a process of trial and error. I will start off with that preface. There's a reason why you chose to apply to whatever school you're currently listening to this from, whether it's Penn or another institution. There is a specific field of study that you wanted to get into. Maybe there was even a specific faculty member whose research, you were exposed to while you were in high school. Just having a conversation with them about what you find so interesting about that field or about their work, and asking them, is there a course that you teach that I could take at some point, gets them engaged and interested in, like, why does this person find me fascinating, right? Why does this person find my scholarship so fascinating, and starts to really develop that relationship and that connection. That allows you to see if there's going to be a spark there that generates something deeper over the course of time, right? I was the student representative on the hiring committee that chose the faculty member who, when I went back to NYU, ended up being my dissertation chair. That's not nepotism, I want to be clear. Like, I had a very high GRE score, thank you very much, which he actually teased me about after I was admitted. But that relationship was founded on a shared interest in religious pluralism and its impact on the college-going experience. And it was through that I was able to, really get involved with research and be a successful PhD student with time. One of my mentors for my master program ended up being the president of our professional association and encouraged me to apply to be convention chair. And that leadership role was one of my favorite experiences of all time. It's why the poster from it is in the background of every Zoom meeting that I have. And it's about cultivating those experiences that are meaningful and significant to you and what you value about either your field of study or the profession that you want to get into.
I like what you kind of mentioned, like how your advisors come into it, and I think a thing a lot of Penn students kind of struggle with is how do I start talking to professors like they're people, because like I feel like especially if you're either an underclassman getting into research or an underclassman in a class, and you go in an office hour, you go in a lab, and you're just kind of thinking like task orientated, question orientated, you don't get to build that relationship up. Do you think there's any tips you have in that regard?
Yes. Your grade in a class is not going to be the thing that derails your future in any way. In fact, some of the deepest relationships with faculty come from the conversations that you have with them as you're struggling with their class. So don't focus the conversation around how can I get the extra points to move this from, an 88.5 to a 90.1. Focus it on, what they recommend that you do to really get to know the material well in the class. Focus it on mastery of the subject area and why you're so passionate about it, and that can serve as the foundation for something more. Because if you go into it with here are all the great ways I've contributed in class, can I get an extra 1.5 or so, that's when you are leaning into the transactional nature and the preoccupation with GPA over a meaningful relationship.
Yeah. And I'm just going to go off on a brief tangent because I think it's also important to differentiate like the transactional reactions we have where we don't really want that with professors. You get kind of like a face level relationship, and also you're probably going to get like a worse off letter recommendation from it. But there's also a difference of like kind of cultivating that relationship and then learning how to use that connection as well. And I know I had a professor who I was kind of doing research with. I didn't know much about the field, but I got so passionate in it. I loved working with her. But there came a point where I was like, I feel like I'm not doing much in lab. And also my interests have shifted slightly. And kind of being able to be honest with her and be like, I don't love the research I'm doing. Can you help me pivot in that way? Versus just like kind of leaving a lab once you realize you're not going to get a publication or something. So just like remembering to differentiate that transactions and learning also how to use your resources instead of kind of like wandering alone once you have built that relationship.
Yeah, I think it's important to note the difference between an advisor, a mentor, and a sponsor. They are all going to be invested in your success on a certain level. An advisor is going to offer you advice, and if you take it and make a questionable choice and have a questionable outcome, their reaction is not going to be the same as a mentor who's really focused on your growth. The advisor is still going to care, and I say this as a pre-major advisor who has lots of conversations about the choices that students make. But then there's also going to be the sponsor who's going to want you to reach your maximal potential and succeed because they see it in you too, right? And so having folks that cut across all of those dynamics is super important, and that starts with, as you're saying, investing in the relationship.
For sure. And I think especially on the topic of kind of like figuring out like what you want to do, it's definitely another like struggle that a lot of, I guess, speaking for underclassmen, like definitely a difficult conversation to have, especially like being in a pre-professional community where you feel like you're constantly surrounded by people who are like looking for internships or kind of like stressing over things that are non-academic, especially like career-wise, kind of like, figuring out like how should you use LinkedIn, how should you approach rewriting your resume, what is a cover letter, like conversations such as these, and even picking like what you even want to be for your major or what kind of career you actually want after college is definitely something that a lot of students, I'm sure also like upperclassmen are still like continuing to kind of like face, especially at Penn. So if you can give, I guess, a piece of advice or a couple to someone who might be struggling to figure out what they really want to do during college or after college and are not sure who to ask, what could that be?
I'm sure that someone's brought this up in the past on this podcast, but depending on the study you cite, you're likely to change your professional path at least 3 times over the course of your, 30, 40 plus working years. I think it's important to focus on, the question of what is it that you want to do when you graduate, right? And looking for the folks who can help you make that a reality, and the folks in career services can have lots of those really great conversations. I think, there are also folks in CURF or your advisors who can talk to you about the different pathways once you graduate and what's open to you, whether you're a humanities major, whether you are in Wharton, you're in C's. In nursing, you pretty much know what you're going to do when you graduate. Like, we produce the best nurses in the world here at Penn, right? But there's a plurality of pathways that happen after your first few years too, and those are things that these folks can show you everything that can come after your first job, right? And so, your first job does not dictate the rest of your life, is what I want to start off by saying. And I'll just stop there, because knowing how these conversations can go sometimes, there are lots of weeds we can get lost in. And so I think finding the person who can help you land the first job that will teach you what you want for the rest of your career is probably the most important tip I can offer.
I'm kind of curious too. Are there any other realizations, no matter how random they can be, so you can be as fun as you'd like, that you probably have learned during being a FGLI student at your undergraduate, graduate experience, or maybe even now?
I think so. One of the observations that's in my scholarship is the reality that most of us are not aware of where we actually sit on the socioeconomic ladder until we're exposed to all the other rungs. to realize that, oh wait, yes, so I identify as coming from the lower middle class. And that's after years of research in terms of, where my family was actually situated. Being in environments with extreme levels of wealth kind of elucidates for a lot of folks where they really sit, whether they are coming from a limited income community or they're middle class. Because the gap between the middle class and the incredibly wealthy is a lot more vast than a lot of folks are prepared to recognize. And I think it's always, for me, I'm continuing to learn all the nuances of the gaps between each rung of that ladder, and it's always interesting to watch as other folks learn what comes in between all of those gaps. I honestly did not know what a Canada Goose jacket was until I was doing my dissertation research, and when I looked up and saw how expensive it was. But then in the time since, I've learned about all sorts of signifiers of wealth in the fashion realm that go above and beyond Canada Goose. Yeah. Thank you, Instagram.
I lost my trail of thought here.
I was just going to say, it's really relevant with FGLI students too, because when you're in college, I feel like everyone has kind of that broke college student mentality. So as you're discussing with someone, they might be like, oh yeah, I'm struggling with money so much too. And then you see they went to Cancun over the weekend, literally. And it's a tough thing because you kind of invest personally into those relationships, or especially in your underclass years where you haven't learned to differentiate it quite yet. And that's why I love the FGLI merch that Penn First Plus gives out. It's a great way to have those conversations without that kind of awkward bit where it's oh, you're FGLI too, and we also get really cool merch from it.
The power of the FAFSA and my financial aid award of helping me to figure out that my family was not as financially as comfortable as they like to pretend that they were.
Yeah.
Right. Between getting Pell Grants and taking out Perkins loans, I didn't realize what those really meant until I went to master's program and studied them, and that's when I said, oh, I'm not just the first person in my family to go to college.
Thank you again for speaking today. We also really appreciate you taking some time, an hour, to share with us all of your experiences and your take on the entire FGLI community here at Penn. So do you think there are any ways people can also get in contact with you if they're interested in learning more about the topics that we've discussed so far? Absolutely. I can always be reached. I read all of the emails that come into penfirstplus@upenn.edu. And if I'm not the best person to answer that question, I'll share it with another member of the Penn First Plus team who can get a really good answer.
And then you can always reach us on the web or on Instagram at Penn First Plus.
For those of you who are listening, if you enjoyed today's episode, feel free to follow us on Instagram at the Figly Podcast and check us out on our website, figlypodcast.wordpress.com. For our other episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube at the Figly Podcast. If you have anyone or topics you would be interested in listening to, please message us on Instagram. Thanks again, and we hope you join us next time.